So I would like to introduce Lynn Holt, who will introduce our series for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody in the Oak Room and all the folks who are participating on Zoom. We have 7 speakers lined up for this course who the voters are looking toward the 2022 midterm election. 36 gubernatorial seats will be on the ballot in 2022, including Florida's Governor DeSantis. 34 U.S. Senate seats are up for election in 2022, including Senator Marco Rubio. We've got the House of Representatives with 2-year terms. And in addition, 88 of the country's 99 state legislative chambers will hold elections in November 2022, reflecting over 6,000 legislative seats. And then, of course, there are local elections. So it is never too soon to have a more informed and nuanced understanding of who we are as voters. Each speaker will share his or her perspective on some aspect of the U.S. voting base, and a few speakers in this course will focus on Florida. One speaker, Michael Martinez, who will be speaking next week, will also devote part of his presentation to non-voters. So today I am honored to introduce Dr. Ken Wald as the first speaker in this series. He is no stranger to ILR, and I believe he will be speaking also at the Supreme Court course, right, this semester. So he's often a presence at ILR courses. Dr. Wald is a distinguished professor emeritus of political science at the University of Florida, where he taught courses on public opinion, political behavior, and research methods. He is the author of 6 books and numerous scholarly articles. He has also been a visiting professor and scholar at the University of Manchester in England, Linnaeus University in Sweden, the University of Toronto, the University of Michigan, Harvard University, and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His most recent book, Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism, won the National Jewish Book Award in 2020. Please welcome Dr. Ken Wald. Thank you.
Well, Lynn, thank you for that kind introduction. Can I confirm that you can hear me? Good, okay. When I was first invited to be here, I was really looking forward to it, not just because I enjoy speaking to the ILR audiences, but because I thought it would be the first time in almost 2 years that I was in a room with the people I was speaking to. I gave something like 15 Zoom talks from late 2019 through the end of 2020 and early 2021. And I was really looking forward to being in the presence of an audience, to have that eye contact and just the vibe that comes when you're there. So while I regret that, I'm nonetheless very pleased to be here and to talk to you about the forthcoming midterm elections, as we call them, in November of 2022. My task today is to really cover, is to achieve 2 goals. First of all, I would like to help you understand the talks that you're going to be hearing over the following 6 weeks, to set those up for you, because every one of the speakers is going to be talking about the voting patterns of certain groups, and almost everything we know about those patterns comes from polling or survey research, as we like to call it. And so what I want to talk to you is how you can assess those surveys and understand better what the other speakers are talking about. The other thing I want to do is to perhaps make you better informed consumers of polls. You're going to be exposed to an absolute deluge of polls over the next 2 years. You may be asked to participate in them, but you'll certainly be reading about them or hearing about them. And one of the things I've discovered over the years is that there are a lot of things about polls that informed consumers need to understand to sort out the good from the bad. So those are my principal objectives in speaking to you today. Okay. So what I'm going to cover today is, first of all, the validity and reliability of political polls. By validity, I simply mean, do they measure what they claim to measure? Reliability, are they consistent in measuring what they say they're measuring? I'm going to talk about the difference between academic surveys, which are to me more important than commercial polls, but try to help you notice the distinction between them. And I'm going to summarize what academic surveys tell us about how people vote, the choices they make, what factors drive their turnout, and so forth and so on. And as I said, I want to improve your ability to make judgments about the kinds of surveys that you're going to be hearing about. Next slide, please. So for about 70 to 80 years, political scientists have been studying the way voters behave. The scientific study of this really begins in a very modest way in the 1930s, but takes off and has become a very well-established science since then. And traditionally, there are three ways we try to study how people behave, how they vote, how they choose to vote for candidates, and so forth and so on. There are, of course, experiments as an opportunity. And as you know from psychology, experiments are the principal form through which they study and understand political behavior. Experiments took a long time to catch on in political science because we want our findings to be generalized to the population beyond those who participate in the experiment. And since most experiments are done in academic settings, most of which have students as their subjects, we have been very skeptical that those particular groups can be generalized, their patterns can be generalized to the larger population. And so consequently, experiments took a long time to become very common within the discipline. We also use two techniques that are fairly similar called focus groups or depth interviews. And these are predominantly qualitative rather than quantitative ways of studying behavior. I'm sure you've all seen the advertisements or videos of focus groups. You recruit a bunch of people, they're invited into a place, they sit around a table or a room, and there's a moderator who throws out questions to them. And the idea is to sort of get at how people in that group think about the topic that you're trying to understand. A related method is the depth interview, where you have a one-on-one situation between the interviewer and the participant in the study, the interviewee. And again, instead of giving them a very structured questionnaire, it's more like a conversation. And again, the idea is that you get a deeper and richer understanding through these qualitative methods. We use both of these things today, but mostly to help us design good quantitative surveys. So focus groups are often convened before we go into the field because we want to see what terms people use, how they understand those terms, and the like. And depth interviews are often conducted after the survey to try to, again, find out the motivations that people engage in. So they're not typically a substitute for surveys, but they're often an integral part of their design. And then finally, we come to surveys or polls, and I should stress there's no specific meaning difference between those terms. Surveys have been for a very long time now the preferred, the most common way in which we try to understand how voters behave. And a survey has two essential components. To begin with, the questionnaire, which we call the instrument, is standardized. In principle, there's a set of questions, they are ordered in a certain way, and respondents are asked to give responses to these statements. The hope is that the interviewer, if there is an interviewer, ask each question precisely how it is worded on the instrument and records accurately what the participant, who we call a respondent, says. The group of people who participate in a survey, and again, we use the term sample here, should be obtained by methods that accord with the theory of probability. I'm not going to go into great detail about probability here, except to say that the virtue of probability is it is more likely than any other method to give us a group of respondents who resemble the larger population to whom we want to generalize our findings. There are non-probability surveys, there are surveys that violate probability, and we have much lower confidence that those will give us an accurate view of public opinion. I taught both an undergraduate and a graduate class on survey methods, and strangely enough, teaching probability methods turned out to be a lot of fun. But I'm going to spare you that because there are other things to talk about. Surveys that are done in the political realm typically fall into one of three categories. There are private surveys, and these are done typically by a candidate's political organization and or political parties. Sometimes an interest group which is supporting a candidate may pay for the survey and give the results to the candidate, which is considered a contribution under the Federal Election Commission rules. The point of private surveys is essentially to help the candidate devise a strategy and plan a campaign that will work. And these surveys are typically done with the goal of trying out certain themes, seeing what issues and concerns the voters have that the candidate can address. They're often done to see how well known the candidate is versus the other people competing in the primary, assuming there is one, and compared to the presumed nominee from the other party. In addition to knowing how well known they are, candidates want to know, what do people think about them? Do they consider them, in terms of their personal traits or their past behavior and the like? So these are designed for launching a campaign. Now, as I've said, they are usually confidential. They are not for public distribution. They will, however, frequently be leaked. But what will be leaked is very selective. It's things that make the candidate look good. And my advice when you read about a survey that was conducted privately is that you discount it as far as knowing who's going to be elected or not, because they're very much driven by the particular needs of the campaign. They're not objective surveys. They're surveys done by people who typically want the candidate elected. Academic surveys, which I'll talk about later, have the goal of explaining the behavior. That is, why did the elections turn out the way they did? And what does that teach us about our models of explaining political choice? More about that later. Finally, most of the surveys that you're going to hear about are commercial in nature. That is, they are conducted for public consumption. They do the survey and they release the results via media, via the web, or other sources of information. Commercial surveys tend to have two aspects that are important to understand. They focus overwhelmingly on what we call the horse race. That is, who's winning, who's losing, who's gaining ground, and who's losing. They're very much focused on the here and now, more so than academic surveys or any of the private surveys that we've talked about earlier. Secondly, they are often used to boost advertising for the sponsor. The most well-known survey, certainly one of the earliest political surveys, was associated with George Gallup. Gallup, for many years, treated the political surveys that got so much attention essentially as loss leaders. They were made available for free, widely publicized, and they simply boosted the real business of the Gallup organization and most survey organizations, which is market research. Gallup would frequently add 5 or 10 political questions to surveys about detergents or toilet paper or whatever, simply to enhance the business enjoyed by that. I don't mean to suggest commercial surveys are somehow wrong or bad, but that history, I think, has some impact on what's being done. I apologize for the phone. It's the third daily call about extending my warranty on my car. Okay, next slide, please. So we have different ways of conducting the survey, of implementing it. Since the 1970s, the most common way has been via telephone. That is, we would have live human interviewers sitting in some call shop somewhere, and most of which, by the way, were located in my home state of Nebraska, because they're close to all the time zones, being in the middle of the country, and B, people from Nebraska have what are considered vanilla English accents that can be easily understood by people on the East Coast, the West Coast, or in between. I've lost mine, but that was once the case. Any event, you have an interviewer who contacts a potential respondent who has been drawn from a sample, again, ideally following the laws of probability. And the interviewer explains the purpose of the survey and then proceeds to ask the respondent to participate. If the answer is yes, they ask questions and the respondent is expected to answer. These became the dominant tool of survey research starting in the late 60s, and their dominance is only now being challenged by other methods. But a lot of surveys are done by telephone, and I think it's unlikely that you can get through an election year if you have a landline or even a cell phone without getting such a request. We also have a technique known as intercept polling, which, as the term implies, means that the interviewer goes out to find the respondent rather than sitting in a call shop. The most well-known example are exit polls, where the organizers of the survey identify a certain set of precincts, which for a variety of reasons are thought to give a good sample of the overall electorate, and interviewers are stationed at those precincts with clipboards and signs, and they go up to voters as they're leaving the poll and invite them to take the survey face to face. These kinds of surveys have become less common, and even in major elections now, because of the move to mail balloting, even more so than the development of cell phones, they have to be supplemented with other kinds of surveys. Again, a live interviewer approaches respondents. The big change in polling is the move to the internet. It has produced the kinds of changes that it has in every other aspect of our lives. Internet surveys cover a very wide range. Some are surveys that you will fill out on your computer, your tablet, or your computer. Others are administered by email or on your phone. There's a whole range of different possibilities, different approaches that we utilize in internet-based survey research. They are clearly the wave of the future. The few face-to-face surveys and telephone surveys left are typically done by governments which have the resources and the times to do them. But the vast majority of political polls are going to be conducted through one of these three methods or some combination of them. And again, I want to stress, I'm giving you the highlights here. Increasingly, some polling organizations are using what are called IVR surveys, which are interactive voice recording surveys where there is no interviewer on the other end of the phone. It is instead a recorded interview. You're asked to type in 1 for yes or 2 for no. I don't think those are particularly good, but it just shows you the range of options that we're now using. Postal surveys are common in other domains, but because of the time demands of politics and elections, they're almost never used for election polling. We've also, the other big trend that's developing apart from the internet and what we call mixed mode surveys is the development of what's called address-based sampling. The US Postal Service now makes available for sale its list of every residential address in the United States. And increasingly, that is the source from which people draw samples. You can also, if you're doing election polling, obtain in most places a list of registered voters. It won't be 100% accurate, but those are typically public record, as they are in Florida. And there are companies, Catalyst is the best known, which will provide you such a list and arrange it in a form that you can use it for sampling. So this is just, again, a very general overview about surveys. Let's go on to the next slide. So over the years in teaching and talking about polling, I've discovered that a lot of people are concerned about issues which frankly are not as serious as they imagine. And they tend, on the other hand, not to worry about the things that professional survey researchers worry about. So in terms of the things that are not as troublesome as they imagine, we would start from the fact that if you survey using the internet, we've got a population in the United States, probably around 10%, which claims not to have any access to the internet. It's probably a little bit higher, but the so-called digital divide has been narrowing over time. Now, this may or may not be a problem because it's not clear that the population that doesn't have web access is different politically from the population that does. But if that's the case, we've discovered ways to get around this. A lot of internet surveys will call or write potential respondents first, follow those contacts up, and if they don't have access to the web, the company will actually provide it. Usually they'll send the person a tablet which is web enabled. They'll go over with them how you use it, and the person will simply have to commit to participate in a certain number of polls to maintain the service. So we have ways of dealing with those who are not internet able. Many of them, it turns out, are, but they don't think of their cell phones as an internet tool, which in fact they are. Cell phones, when they were developed, really concerned people because with the decline of landlines, fewer and fewer people have them, of course. Cell phones present different challenges. Your cell phone number, your area code, may not mean that you live in the place where your area code is. Both of my daughters have area codes from where they went to college and got their plans, and they don't live in those places anymore. Again, we found ways to deal with the cell phone problem technically. And any survey today that doesn't, telephone survey that doesn't have a particular procedure for dealing with cell phones is going to miss a significant part of the population. But we know how we can overcome that through a variety of sampling techniques. Finally, there are people who are very skeptical of any political poll because they're skeptical of sampling. That is to say, I will get people who say, how can a sample of, say, 500 people chosen at random accurately represent the population or the voting age population or the registered voter population of Alachua County? Well, again, the answer to that is that sampling works, and it works thanks to what's called the law of large numbers. Now, again, don't panic. I'm not going to discuss in detail the law of large numbers. But if you follow probability methods in choosing your sample, and if your sample is, in the hundreds or thousands, you can be quite confident that the population to whom you generalize is accurately reflected by your sample. Sampling is not really the problem per se. The problem is in implementing samples, people take shortcuts. But if you follow the rules of probability theory, you will generally be okay. Now, the bigger problems that I think affect surveys come in several categories. We sometimes, as the late Philip Converse, a survey research pioneer, said, sometimes we use surveys to ask people more than they know. That is, the idea of a survey, when you conduct it, is you want to know people's attitudes and opinions about some issue or their views of the candidates in some upcoming election. And you assume that they have attitudes about the issues, that they do have preferences about the candidates. And so your job is to ask them the question, and their job is to give you their attitude or opinions. The fact of the matter is that many people do not have attitudes about the questions we want to ask them, nor do they have preferences about candidates or issues in an upcoming election. And what we've discovered by using cognitive psychology is that people often will construct an answer as a result of us asking the question, and in effect create an attitude or opinion that they don't really hold. We ask people things about topics they don't know about or they don't care about. And surprisingly, people rarely say, I'm not interested or I don't know what that is. Usually they'll give you an answer because they don't want to look stupid in the eyes of the interviewer. And we've discovered that those answers are really soft, meaning slight changes in wording or the passage of time will generate a different answer to those questions. So we should not ask people about issues that they don't know about. If you went out today to ask people how they feel about proposals in the Biden tax plan to eliminate the step up for people who have tangible assets, there would be, out of 1,000 interviews, 2 people who understood what you were talking about. yet you would get probably 70% saying they approve of it or they reject it. So we shouldn't ask people more than they reasonably know. Nor should we ask people questions before we would expect them to know anything. We'll be seeing elections starting next month in which people are asked if the election of 2022 were being held today, which candidate would you vote for senator, for governor, whatever. The reality is people often don't think about politics until a month or so before the election. So they don't really have preferences. So asking people their political views and using those to forecast the election far out is not particularly useful as a method of understanding voter behavior. So those are two problems about assuming respondents know more than they actually know. Will respondents help us if we want to survey them? Well, we have two challenges. We've got to get in touch with them. That is, we've got to contact them. And there are a lot of ways people can avoid contact. If you get a letter in the mail that is from a company you don't know, you might very well tear it up and hopefully recycle it. If you get a phone call from a number you don't know, you might just not answer it and let it go to voicemail. Or if you have, active spam filters, it might just send that call into your voicemail. Either case, and the other reality of life is that people increasingly live 24/7. And consequently, their ability to speak on the phone is limited. So we're having increasing problems just getting in touch with respondents. And that means it takes longer to construct a sample that represents the population we're interested in. Even if you do get in touch with the person, there's no guarantee they'll agree to be in the survey. Cooperation rates, as we call them, have really been dropping. And they drop for a lot of reasons. People, again, are busy. They're in the middle of cooking dinner. They're dealing with a crisis. They have multiple jobs. So time is really valuable. And consequently, they just don't feel they have the time. They don't like politics. They resent the intrusion of a phone call or other means of contact. And so we've had fewer and fewer people agreeing to be in surveys. There is some thought that this might account for the lower proportion of respondents who say they're voting Republican than we know exist in the population, because it seems that Republicans are less likely to cooperate with surveys. We're not yet clear how important this is, but cooperation rates are a real concern, something we worry about. When it comes to forecasting elections, two other problems crop up. You want, in forecasting an election, to have a sample all of whose members are registered to vote, because unregistered people cannot vote. That's the single biggest barrier to voting. And the overall national vote registration rate varies depending upon space and time between 2/3 and 3/4, which leaves millions of people who are not registered. Well, what happens, and if you don't use a sample that consists of registered voters by buying one of those expensive lists, particularly when you're at the state or national level, you're relying on respondents answering the question, are you registered to vote at this address in the forthcoming election? You're at risk of people lying, not telling the truth. We know from decades of survey research that people over-report what is considered socially positive behavior and underreport what is considered negative behavior. 99% of Americans claim that they contribute to charity. A very high proportion indicate they go to church. Everybody apparently runs or goes to gyms. At least that's based on surveys. But we know that's not the case, that people over-report those kinds of behavior. Conversely, if we're interested how many people engage in bribery or how many people, let's say, observe pornography on their computers, but apparently nobody does, because people don't like to report that and look bad in the eyes of whoever's sponsoring the survey as they see it. So if you don't validate the registration of your voters, that is, your sample, confirm that in fact they are registered, you're going to be generalizing the behavior of registered voters, but it'll be based on data that includes unregistered voters. And by the way, I should ask, if we ask people if they're going to vote in the next election, everybody is going to vote in the next election, even though voter registration and turnout are well below 100%. Now, if you're trying to predict an election, it's not enough to know that the people in your sample are registered and intend to vote. You need to identify what we call likely voters, people who have the attitudes, the background, and the history, which tells us they're going to go to the polls. That is more art than science. And I think that one of the problems we've had in recent elections is that a lot of people who are unlikely voters have been voting. Certainly that was the case in 2020. Much higher turnout of people with lower levels of education, rural residents, and other traits that typically reduce their likelihood of voting. But that is yet another source of error that you can have. So all of these problems are things that you need to be careful for in evaluating a survey. And as we'll see on the next slide, it's not clear that they're always taken into account. Commercial surveys, again, surveys that are intended to make money, are driven by commercial considerations. They're driven in part by deadlines, because people always want to survey on the latest episode, the latest issue. Whatever happens today, for example, in the votes in the House about the infrastructure program, there'll be people starting surveys tonight and trying to get them done in a day or two, because that's how political polling is done. It's driven by the calendar. And the reality is, therefore, you don't have much time. And secondly, there are financial costs to doing a survey properly. Let's say you get somebody on the phone who doesn't want to participate. You should try to talk them into it or schedule a time for an interview later. But that takes time, and a lot of commercial polls, that's just not what they're going to deal with. The real danger of these shortcuts is that you're going to get what we call a biased sample. And I want to stress we use the term bias very differently here than we use it in ordinary language. A biased sample, meaning the group of people who you interview, is a sample that does not closely resemble the population to whom you want to generalize your findings. It is biased in the sense that it may have more women than it should based on the population. It may have fewer people of color than it should based on the population. It's simply not a close replica of the people you're trying to explain, whose behavior you're trying to explain. Now, what some people do when they have a biased sample is they weight each individual participant differently to, in effect, recompose the sample. Let's say, for example, we should have, and I'm making up these numbers, we know that among registered voters, let's say 55% are women and 45% are men. And so the sample should be close to that. But if you had, let's say, 70% women and 30% men, you would need to adjust those percentages. And each woman would be downweighted, something below 1, and the men would be upweighted, so that the overall sample would match that 55-45. Now, we all weight, and typically we weight on gender and age, which are the two biggest problems that we typically have in the general survey. But every time you do that, your ability, your confidence in the result of your sample, that is to say the sampling error, which is intrinsic in the very process of probability theory, that sample error gets bigger. And instead of saying that these results hold, we expect candidate X to get 54% of the vote, plus or minus 3%, that sampling error may go up to 4, 5, 6, 7%. There is a way of adjusting the sampling error for weighting, but commercial surveys typically don't do that. So right away, you've got a potential biased sample, which could affect the outcome. We also know that virtually every design decision you make in a survey has some effect on the results. That if you use interviewers as opposed to not using interviewers, if you sample one way as opposed to another way, it's going to affect the results. And again, we have statistical tools to adapt to this, but they're seldom used in commercial polls. We also see that, as I mentioned before, when you contact some respondents, they say they won't participate because they're busy or they're not there to get the phone call or to answer the letter. in the best surveys, they will call back or try to reconnect with the respondent at least 5 times before they give up on that respondent and go on to somebody else. And we know that the more often you attempt to contact a respondent, the greater the likelihood of getting somebody who will actually participate, and the more representative the sample will be. And if you just forget that sample, that individual, and go on to the next person, you're going to impair the representativeness of your sample. And again, commercial surveys, in the interest of time, don't care. If there's a busy number, if there's an unanswered phone call, they're going to just choose another respondent. And in the process, they may be biasing the sample. So we also know that the order in which we ask questions of people and in which they're given the response categories we'd like them to use affect the answers they give. So a good survey practice is to take the questions on the survey and rotate their order. That is to say, put questions in different order with different respondents. And the same thing is true of response options. Say you're surveying in 2022, interested in 2024 presidential election. You're going to present people with a question like, if they're Republicans, saying, which of the candidates do you favor for the Republican presidential nomination? And you're going to have 15 names. Some people will only hear the first name you give and they'll stop paying attention. Some people will hear the last name you give. That's the only one that they really care. And consequently, some of the candidates whose names are in the middle, if you've done alphabetical order, just really aren't going to be in the respondent's consciousness. So you should rotate those names as well as the order of the questions. Almost no commercial survey does that. And we think that impairs the representativeness of the results. And finally, just very quickly, when you select a survey, if you contact a household, you shouldn't just let whoever happens to pick up the letter or receive the email or being asked to participate. You should extend probability methods to all the residents of the household who are eligible to vote. And that means you have to introduce another step in the sample selection process, which commercial surveys typically don't do. And the last point, again, I've kind of made it before, but it's worth pointing out. Good surveys will try to convert refusals. That is, take people who said, I don't want to do this, and encourage them to do so. It takes longer. It costs more because time is money, but it generates a better sample than if you just keep adding names subsequently. So all of these are shortcuts in political polls that can affect the validity of those polls, and you need to be skeptical about. Next slide, please. Well, how do you make sense of these surveys? I'd like to say that you could assume that surveys are done by people, pollsters, who are trained in survey research. But the reality is many of them aren't. Many people can set up a shingle, call themselves pollsters, based on being self-taught or maybe had one course on public opinion when they were undergraduates. Now, the smart ones will hire professional survey researchers, but that costs money and that takes time, frankly. So you will get some surveys done by people who, to be quite candid, don't know enough about survey research to be engaging in surveys. Moreover, the information you need to judge the survey has to be provided by the survey researchers themselves. If I want to know exactly what questions were asked, what the dates of the fieldwork were, how many callbacks they made, that sort of thing, the person who does the survey has to make that known, typically through their press release or on their website. And that means they don't need to tell you everything. In fact, some commercial survey researchers treat those things as trade secrets. Well, they're not trade secrets, but they're things which the answers to can really undermine your confidence in the survey. Now, I'd like to tell you that reporters, whether in print or on television and the web, know enough about surveys to screen out the bad surveys. The reality is they don't. Most reporters know very little about surveys, despite efforts to improve their knowledge. So they're not going to be particularly helpful. And a provocative survey that is badly designed will get more playtime than a good survey that is well designed. So what can you do short of taking, the graduate seminar I taught or a similar course elsewhere? My simple rule is to look at what they give you as a basis for judging the survey. Do they give you a copy of the questionnaire itself? Or if you email them, will they provide that? Do they explain how they weighted respondents? And more broadly, how they drew the sample in the first place? And do they explain how some of the potential problems we have, like contact and cooperation, were dealt with? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then you need to be skeptical. The good surveys will provide that information, particularly the good media polls, those co-sponsored by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, as well as some of the network polls are quite good. But if you can't get that information, then I wouldn't put much stock in the survey that you get. And that means that a lot of what's going to be reported is not, in fact, going to rest on a solid scientific basis. The best election surveys are not those that come out before the election. They're those that come out 6 to 8 months after the election. It wasn't until June of this year, for example, that I became confident in the surveys that were being released. And the reason for that is, next slide, please, these are mostly surveys done by academics. And academics here in general do a better job of survey research than commercial pollsters. To begin with, they are trained professionals. They understand sampling theory based on probability theory. They understand the literature about design features of surveys that can influence results. And they'll typically have on staff statisticians and others who know how surveys should be done and will try to follow the rules. They don't release the results of the survey or the data until months later after they've had a time to check and diagnose what was done in the surveys. They are going to use more techniques to validate what they find. Many academic surveys now incorporate experiments. It turns out the web is a great mode for experimentation. You can introduce experiments with large representative samples, bringing together the power of the experiment with the power of the survey. And so they will often use experiments to give us far better understanding than is true of just the simple answers you get from commercial polls. They will do things like cognitive interviews. They will call back some of the respondents and ask to speak to them about the survey. And they will ask questions like, when you answered this question this way and give the answer, what were you thinking about it? What did you mean? Those sorts of things take time. And again, because they take time, they take money. But they're going to get better and deeper understanding. Most academic surveys are released to other academics for free a few months after the survey is done. In fact, journals increasingly require that any study that includes survey data make available the data set. And in addition, the National Science Foundation, which funds a lot of surveys, also insists that the surveys be available to the user community. And that means anything published is subject to rigorous peer review by people who are going to know the questions they need to ask about the survey. So you'll get far more information about these surveys than you will about typical commercial polls. Okay. So I hope that you have at this point a better understanding of what kinds of polls and surveys are more reliable than others and more likely to have valid information. And why, to really understand an election, you have to wait a few months before we get those data and do a deep dive. But I also want to prepare you sort of about the substance of what you're going to be hearing over the next few weeks about the voting patterns of different groups, which are typically assessed through survey methods. And if there's one thing we know about voting in the United States, is that it is driven more than any other factor by partisanship. Now, I want to stress that the partisanship I'm talking about here is not the answer you gave when you registered to vote, when you were asked by the election supervisor's office, do you want to register as a Democrat, a Republican, a non-party affiliate, and so forth and so on. Those are not really particularly good questions. We think of partisanship in political science and in the social sciences as a kind of a cognitive quality. It's something people carry around in their minds. It's part of their self-image, that I am a Democrat or whatever. And we measure it through a question that would be like this. Generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or something else? There might be variations like, in today's politics, do you think of yourself as a, and give you the same choices. But instead of stopping at those three choices, which typically over-report the number of people who are independents, we have follow-up questions. If you say you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're then asked, well, would you say you're strongly attached to the Democratic Party or Republican Party, or only weakly attached to that party? And that gives us strong partisans and weak partisans. We ask the people who say they're independents, would you say you lean more to one of the political parties than the other? And if they say yes, we ask which party. And that means we can divide the independents into three categories: those who lean mostly to the Democratic Party, those who lean more to the Republican Party, and those who don't lean either direction, the pure independents. When we do that, the proportion of independents drops from often a third to more like 10% of the population. Most independents vote like weak partisans because they are partisan leaners. Okay, so that's how we measure partisanship. And again, many commercial surveys will just ask Democrat, Republican, Independent, and they miss a lot of people who are actually more likely to change their vote over the course of a campaign. So partisanship is what primarily drives vote choice and turnout. And as I think you will know, we are in an age of hyper partisanship that has led to levels of polarization that we've not seen before since we've been studying this. Partisanship has become a social identity, and people increasingly judge other people not on other qualities, but whether they're Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. We know, for example, that people are increasingly unlikely to want their own children to marry somebody from the other party. There's a tendency to distrust people from the other party. There is a tendency to think that people from the other party don't share any values with you. Now, this comes from the phenomenon of social identity, which I mentioned a moment ago. We as human beings are prone to join groups. And we do so through a process known as social categorization. We look at the groups in the world, or in an election, we look at the parties and we ask ourselves the question, does this party contain people like me? Are these my people? Or does that party, or do either of them do that? And I'll get to the question at the end of the talk. And given this process about social identity, increasingly partisanship has become central to people's sense of politics and their sense of who they are. It's become much deeper and more fundamental. In the 1950s, it wasn't unusual to see a significant number of people who called themselves Democrats voting Republican, or people who called themselves Republican voting Democrats. Southern whites who call themselves Democrats often voted Republican starting in the 50s and accelerating, and Northeastern Republicans increasingly became Democratic. But at the time, those two groups often voted very differently. Today, to vote is, in a sense, to express your social identity. You're not voting for the issues. You're not voting for the candidate. You're asserting your social identity. Okay. Partisanship is so powerful because it encourages what we call selective exposure and selective perception. Most of us, when we want information about politics or public affairs, will choose sources that I think we instinctively anticipate will reinforce our views. Liberals watch MSNBC, people who are conservative watch Fox News, OAN, or one of the other stations out there. Similarly, we read things that we kind of expect have reinforcement. If I read the New York Times, I read Paul Krugman before I read Nate Duthout, for example, and I'm mispronouncing his name. But we choose information that tends to reinforce what we already believe. Some of us do try to read more widely, but that's not typical. Moreover, we filter what we see or read or hear through that partisan lens. That is to say, we, in a sense, convert it to support our position. And let me just give you a classic example. Gallup, some years ago, you may remember that Ronald Reagan had surgery for prostate cancer during his presidency. And for some bizarre reason, one of the survey firms conducted a survey, and they asked respondents, do you think Ronald Reagan will recover from his prostate surgery sufficiently to continue as president? Now, why anybody would want to ask this, I cannot tell you. Interestingly, Republicans were overwhelmingly certain that he would recover. Democrats were overwhelmingly confident he would not recover in time to continue his presidency, and independents were split right down the middle. I mean, that tells you how people filter something as bizarre as this through a partisan lens. So partisanship, which has more influence today than it did in the 50s, it really drives most political choices. But we know that partisanship is not randomly distributed. Partisanship reflects the influence of a lot of other factors: social class, race, ethnicity, religion, and region among the most prominent. And today we're seeing sharper divisions and more firm divisions among different groups accordingly. We know, for example, that women tend to be more Democratic than Republican, but among women, we know that women who work full-time outside the House are more Democratic than women who do not work full-time outside the House. We know that African Americans are overwhelmingly Democratic. White Americans are predominantly Republican. We know that among religious groups, there are groups who are essentially, they're not all partisans of one group, but they come close to it. For example, evangelical Protestants in the last two elections have given 4 out of 5 of their votes to Donald Trump. And in surveys of who they will support in 2024, despite my doubt, that same percentage of evangelicals, 80%, says they intend to vote for Trump. On the other side of the partisan spectrum, you have American Jews who are as Democratic as evangelical Protestants are Republican. And I'm sure Angela McCarthy will give you even more of that as she goes on. And finally, we have regional differences that are enormously important today. The urban-rural distinction, which has always been there, has become even more important as rural areas have become depopulated, deindustrialized, and so forth, and have become a Republican stronghold. They always have, not always, but they've leaned Republican for a long time, but that pattern has increased, as has the tendency of urban areas to become more Democratic. So there are lots of factors that influence what's there. And what you're going to see over the next few weeks is a kind of an X-ray of the electorate to go beyond simply the partisanship, which tells us what they decide, to see why certain groups exhibit these forms of partisanship and why that drives election results. Okay, with this, I will thank you for your attention, and I guess I'll open the floor to questions. Thanks very much. There was a question to ask about what's called sampling error. And again, without getting into the weeds on this, inherent in the process of sampling, if I choose, let me give an example. If I have a class of 300 students and I tell them to take out a coin and flip it 100 times, you should expect that half the class will say that heads came up more often than tails, and the other half that tails came up more than heads, because that's the probability of each of those. We don't see any reason to think why one or the other should come up more commonly. But for a lot of the things we ask, we don't have that kind of certainty. And it depends on the size of the sample, how confident we can be that the results of the sample will hold for the general population. That is based strictly on the size of the sample, I should point out, more than anything else. So sampling error is not error in the sense of mistake, it's imprecision. So I have to say, instead of 55% of the people support this candidate, 45 support the other, I have to say that right now, 55% of the samples said they're voting for this candidate, but that 55 should be surrounded by what we call the confidence interval of ±3, because given the size of the sample and the distribution, it's possible that that it won't be exactly 55%. So sampling error is a strictly statistical percentage, and it's not a mistake. I will tell you, based on experience, that almost all the problems of surveys are more serious than sampling error. As long as you have a decent number of people, you're going to get a small sampling error. It's all the other things that can go wrong in the process of selecting a sample, in the questions, in asking people more than they know, that introduce far more error than does sampling error. I call them sampling related error, even though it's not, again, those are more likely to be mistakes. Pure sampling error is intrinsic in statistics. And I tell people, if you don't believe in sampling and sampling error, you should never get on an airplane, you should never get on an elevator, you should probably never drive a car, because sampling is intrinsic to the process by which those products are tested. So sampling error is just one of those things we live with. The New York Times does a really good job in the surveys they publish, in which they give you the sampling error, but they add the line, most or many other aspects of the survey can produce inaccurate results, or words to them. And that's really, frankly, where you need to worry about surveys. Okay, I guess the questions will be in the chat mode.
We
No.
have both. Let's go ahead with John Reiskin.
Okay.
Sure. A lot of us depend on those who summarize these polls, such as 538, or whatever that one was. And in 2016, they were so unbelievably wrong about so many things that a lot of us lost any faith in commercial polling. In other words, they seem to summarize a whole bunch of responsible, network and newspaper polling. Oftentimes the polls are sponsored by several groups like New York Times and LA Times together, or NBC, and this sort of thing. So that disastrous year for polling has gotten us quite gun shy about them. And so can you give us reasons to be more confident in the future?
Well, I can probably do the opposite more easily. In 2020, the results in some cases were actually worse. And I think the difference is who is reporting on polls. I have a lot of respect for 538, which was Nate Silver's group, and there are other, the New York Times has its own now, equivalent of that. And the people who do those are polling professionals, and they're very good at warning about the pitfalls in various surveys. We know from 2016 that particularly the state level surveys, which you need to know to predict the presidential race, tend to be the weakest kinds of surveys that we have done, that are done. They have typically relatively small samples, so sampling error is a matter of concern. And they're often done by people who don't have particularly good training in survey research. Again, New York Times is good. And some organizations are really good. The Pew Research Center, which typically gives most of its stuff after the election, is probably the best. It's not really a commercial poll in that they're nonprofit, but they're really very good at what they do. There's some thought that one of the leading hypotheses was it was the shy Trump voters argument from 2016, that Trump told people to ignore the surveys, or to ignore what they're hearing, to ignore TV, not to participate in surveys, and that they answered the call, and therefore the samples were biased in that they underrepresented Republican voters and Trump voters. From what I've seen of the experimental studies, there's very little evidence yet to support that argument. And again, as I said, what I think happened more likely was that you had the problem of surveys weight respondents by their likelihood to vote. And I think what happened in both 2016 and 2020 is that Trump appealed to people who normally have low rates of voter participation. That is to say, less income, less occupational status, less education, And normally they're not as likely to vote, but they did. And I think some of the same thing happened on the Democratic side with the ease of mail balloting, voting by mail, which enabled some people who couldn't vote, even in early voting, which, as you know, in Florida has been constantly narrowed. But they simply voted. And so I think in some sense, it's more likely that it was a result of that than it was a problem of that participation. The survey research community has been very concerned about this. It's sort of considered a challenge on the same order as 1948, when all the polls, and there weren't that many, predicted that Dewey would defeat Truman, and the reverse happened. And so there's lots and lots of research going on at this point. At this point, the easiest thing to do is to get on 538, which is now part of ESPN, I think, or it's something unlikely. That's any event that's out there, and see what they have to say. But American presidential elections, particularly the Electoral College, are challenging because it's 50 different elections, and if you add some of the territories and the like, it's even more than 50. And that seems to be the weak point. I do think the other thing people are looking at, as I said, is, are generally cooperative people more likely to participate? Is non-cooperation, I'm busy, I'm making dinner, my kid is screaming, I've got to race out to a school meeting. Is it that, which we all experience, or is it simply that people on the political right are less cooperative in general because they see it as part of the media, which they distrust? So I think we don't yet know. Again, I look at 538 and some of the other sources. There's another good organization that I haven't looked at their website recently, called the National Council on Public Polls, NCPP. And members of that organization agree, and they're mostly commercial pollsters, and mostly state level pollsters, agree to a certain code of behavior about what information they'll provide and the like. I don't know if they're doing it now, because maybe it's now seen as too political. But that's another good place to look and get a feel for many of these institutions.
Thanks.
Good question, John. Thank you.
And do you see the question in chat about are more individuals departing from the partisan preferences of their parents?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Partisanship we used to think it was largely inherited from parents, because when we studied young people, we found a very high correspondence between the partisanship of the children and the partisanship of the parents. And if the two parents, assuming it was a two-parent family, were split, the kids were often split or prone to independence. That's gradually, we think, been disappearing. The model now suggests an age-related measure that up until the age of about 30, partisanship is not very stable. From 30 to 50 is when people are likely, and in their 30s, people are likely to pick a partisan side if they do, and more or less stick to it. And so that would mean there'll be probably lesser affiliation or adherence to what the parents say, more that people decide as they get into that status of life where they see themselves as more affected by these decisions. So I do think the parent-child bond in politics is weaker today, but I see this is not so much new. It's been a gradually evolving process. But still, parents' partisanship is important. It's not, it has an effect, just not as strong as it used to. So if your kids vote for the other party to torment you, it's part of a larger trend.
Richard Petway, go ahead. You're muted. Richard?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm concerned about the interaction of the questions that are in the survey. We know from a fact that if economics, such as income level, is asked, it is terribly biased. The result is biased upward for most individuals. They just don't want to be poor. And so my question is, if you had more questions that are biased, would the person answering the survey have more unreliability because they recognize that the questions that are being asked by the pollster are potentially biased, and therefore they lose interest in the independence of the questions, because some of the questions, such as finance and location, are often not valid to the true population numbers.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I'm interested in the interaction between the survey questions and their reliability to the whole survey.
Okay. The dilemma we have in constructing any survey, and it doesn't matter what you're surveying on, is that people you interview on any topic have a finite amount of time that you can expect them to vote to a survey. Okay. And good ethics, again, if you have to go through a human subjects committee, as I would if I were doing a survey as part of my research at the university, means I should do enough practice interviews to give an estimate of how long it's going to take, and I should stick to that time. So we have a finite amount of time or space on the questionnaire before respondents lose interest, break off the interview, or start giving us nonsensical answers. On the other hand, we want to know a lot more. So we always have pressure to ask more questions than we have time. And the hardest thing to do is to delete those questions that you think are important. The question about income is a particular problem. And it's a problem because people, frankly, want to keep it private more so than they want to state that they have higher income rather than lower income. On any survey I've ever done, and I think most survey researchers would say the same thing, the question that generates the most no opinion or non-response is income. Now, what do we do about that? Sometimes, and again, sometimes, for example, we can collect location information, either from the sample information we got if we bought a list, or electronically by the IP address. And we can at least locate people geographically and use the geographical data we have on income and occupation and the like to kind of place them there and to cover up for the people who say, no opinion. There are also statistical techniques, which I'm not going to go into, that can cover for that better. People have also come up with alternate questions. One survey researcher simply asked people, do you have an American Express card or not? And that, according to them, divides the electorate in sort of middle class versus working class. I mean, there are a lot of different things people have done, but their concern about income is more privacy, I think, than it is that they want to inflate how much they earn. I haven't seen any research that suggests that question biases other questions. The respondents lose out. And that's the reason, by the way, we always are supposed to ask that at the end of the interview, where it will have no lingering effects on other questions. Class is hard to measure for other reasons. We're not quite sure what social class is, or educational or occupational strata is. So different people measure it different ways. There's a lot of work going on about self-identification. Would you call yourself middle class, working class, or upper class, middle class, working class, lower class? And we know that very few people are going to say they're lower class unless they're proud of it, and the like. But I don't see that as, I think that's an accuracy problem more than a bias question. So I hope I've addressed your question.
One quick follow-up.
Sure.
If you don't ask them their income, but you ask them the tax bracket in which they paid their last income tax, does that improve the results of the touchy question about income?
Well, I don't know, because most people don't know their tax bracket. I would bet you anything. But so one of the things we sometimes do is when the person says, I don't want to share that, and say, okay, would you say it's between, what you earn is between 30,000 and 80,000? More people are willing to say that than are willing to give us a number. And then if they do that, we say, okay, is it between 30,000 and 50,000 or 50,000 and 80,000? We can get people to narrow it down. It seems that when you ask them to volunteer a number, apart from the fact that many people don't know that number, and I am one of them, I could not tell you, if you asked me my income, I'd give it to you with a confidence interval as wide as this room, because I never remember that number. But you can narrow it down. That seems to be the preferred way when you really need to know that. But that takes time, and that takes money, because it takes, it takes a lot of the time you've got to interview. But it's
Thank
an
you.
interesting question. But of the things we measure, that's not, I think, the one that we worry about as much as your question would suggest we should worry about it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Lynn, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Ken. That was really a good talk. I remember looking at Nate Silver at one point or another right before the election, and he had assigned grades to various commercial polls.
Mhm.
And I was wondering whether there was such a thing as an umbrella organization that did that for academic polling or surveys.
There are, again, the National Council of Public Polls, is the largest one but it takes in mostly commercial polls. Although some of the major academic surveys that are continuing do participate. There are a lot of organizations. There's the American Association for Public Opinion Research, which incorporates both practitioners and academics. But I don't, and they have a code of ethics. They will occasionally, if a member produces a poll that violates some norm that they have agreed to, they will sanction, they will censure individuals. How much difference this makes is not at all clear, but it is not a closely policed field of endeavor, I would point out, for the most part. Pollsters have a lot of freedom. And I've met some commercial pollsters who are as honest as the day is long. They try hard to keep up. And some of them now are partnering with academic organizations. The Associated Press has started several years ago something called VoteCast, and they cooperate with the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And that is one of the best academic survey organizations there is. And the person who runs their sampling, who I happen to know, is one of the top, sampling statisticians in the world. And so I think that they're insisting on bringing in the academic rigor to the commercial sector, while still allowing the commercial sector to do what it wants to do. There are some polls that are done by academic institutions, at least have the name on them, which I would argue are essentially commercial. There's some universities which, to be frank, I don't know much about, which have done polls that get some attention. And some of them, because I know the people involved are quite good. Some of them I'm persuaded are done by people who just have no real understanding. And it's a way of advertising the name of the university. So you don't always know in even making that distinction. So unfortunately, we don't police it. We learn these things after the fact. The only person who I think has ever really been hurt by this is a pollster called Frank Luntz, who used to work for Gallup, whose reputation was pretty well savaged because he tended to do a lot of, frankly, things that seemed unethical. But no, even missing on a poll is not going to affect you for very long, because people have short-term memories on that.
Thank you, Ken. Lynn, as you can imagine, I think we could keep talking for another hour, but we are going to end here. We appreciate your time, everyone. And Lynn, do you want to preview next week?